Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Goblin Ringleader podcast. I'm your host, Jack, and today we're going to be doing a very special episode. I was asked by somebody to make a magic how to episode. So, let's say that you just started hearing about magic from your friends or from maybe a local card shop that you drove by, or maybe you saw the ads for it online. What I highly recommend is that you do some research online. You can open up a bunch of different websites um, to find information. There's two websites that right off the bat I'd recommend. I'm going to pull them up real quick. The first one is you just type in magic into Google, and the first thing that really pops up if you type in magic or just MTG is the Magic the Gathering official site. That's the first thing that I'd open up. The second thing that I'd open up is if you want to look at any deck lists, right? I would highly recommend MTG Goldfish. So it's just MTG for Magic the Gathering and Goldfish. Everybody knows how to spell Goldfish. And then, so we have two websites up. And what I'm going to start with, share my screen. Let's say you just got into Magic. I highly recommend do a quick Google search and go to the Magic the Gathering. It's called magic.wizards.com. I'm going to zoom some of this out for you. Boom. So on this website, they have a lot of different things. They're going to talk about the things that they have sales-wise going on and the events and the announcements, articles that they have for returning players. For a new player, what I want to highlight is the card database, which is where all Magic cards are kept. If you want to look for white cards and you want to look for white creatures, you just go white creature search. And it will give you every creature that's white in all of Magic. Now that's very broad. But if you want to look for a specific format, let's say you're trying to find a commander card. Commander is a very general, casual format. Formats are groupings of Magic cards that decide which cards are legal and which cards are not legal in that format. So if you want to play with a card from way back in the beginning of Magic, you only have a couple choices from the formats where that card is able to be played. The newer formats, newer cards are able to be played, and they usually have restrictions, whether it's 7 years or 7 sets or everything after a certain point in time. But this card database is really, really, really nice if you're looking for just you want to just read Magic cards. You want to just know what things do, right? You go to whatever set you're looking at. A lot of people start off with standard because that's the most common, most readily available Magic cards are the ones that are being sold right now. The Magic is currently producing sets all the time, and the newest sets in standard usually have easily accessible decks, archetypes. Archetypes just mean strategies. So when we talk about a meta or an archetype, those are just terms to define strategies that we're using in Magic. And so if you're looking for the standard format and you just want to play a certain color, you pick a color, you pick a format, and if you're looking for a certain card type, you choose a card type. If not, you could just look at all the cards and you can just read. A lot of my early time in Magic was spent just reading a lot of the cards, and then you screenshot ones that you really enjoy, or you save the image to your computer. So that's one way. The other way that you can do it is you go to MTG Goldfish, and they have this thing called the metagame breakdown, which is the overall percentage of decks that are being played, how many, and what the percentage of the overall meta of decks being played are that type. So this is just strategy. If you like strategy, you can really get into the numbers. It's all statistics, which is beautiful. But the reason we like this website is because not only do they have all of these formats that you can look at and you can figure out what decks you want to play, you can also go all the way to the bottom, and usually they have they have a budget section where if you get down close enough to the bottom, they don't have it in standard, but I know in modern there's a specific section that's dedicated to budget cards. And a lot of these standard decks, if you go down to the bottom, they're like under $200. And I would say, oh, this one's $39. And you can just find something that's like really cool, really niche to get you into it. I will say that a lot of the expense in Magic is lands, and so you can cut a lot of expensive cards. Like this is a $300 deck, but if we go to 100, that's 220. Boom. We do 120. If we look at this, a lot of these are just the lands, right? This is $40, $42 plus 24 is this is $68 plus another 24. So you have like $100 $100 in the lands exclusively. And so like you don't have to play Sheltered by Ghosts, right? You can cut all of the other cards that are like expensive. Entity Tracker is not needed. Sheltered by Ghosts is not needed. You can, when you're starting, you can play other kinds of cards. And it's nice because if you're a competitive player and you don't really care so much about like learning like all of the rules right off the bat, you can find a deck and then you can port it over into the third thing that I'd recommend is first thing, Google Magic, go to the Gather website, read an article, get familiarized. Also, the other thing that's really nice about this website is Magic Arena is a free platform where all the cards are available. You do have to slowly work your way into collecting them, but they're all available on, or I can't say all available. The cards that are in standard and mostly some of the newer formats are on there. None of the ancient cards are on this because it's a newer platform. Some of them are, some of them aren't. However, Arena is one of the best tools that you can use to explore Magic. So if you download Arena and you boot it up, they have launchers for Mac and they have downloads for different softwares. You can also get it on your phone, mobile, and this is the best way to play Magic for free. You start off with a collection of. I have a bunch of decks. I'm sorry, I brew all the time. But if we go down to the beginning, right? Snack Time, Second Chance, Saddle Up, Power to the People, Crack the Case, Desert Oasis, Dynamite, Fairy Pranks, Goblins Everywhere, Outlaw Posse, Cold Blood Achilles, Ancient Discovery, and then all these new decks are decks that I built. So from here all the way down to here are free decks that you get, and they're not like, let's go to Dinos. They're not like the most amazing decks. They like, you don't see something insane. You get a couple of rares and mythics. Now, for very new players, I know I've been going very fast. It's a good place to start right here. So Magic is a game about resources. In a lot of other card games, the way that the game progresses is you take actions. All of your actions in Magic are limited by mana, which is a resource. Mana is produced by your lands. Lands are played one at a time, one per turn. And they have usually every card has words on it that matter. So when you're explaining a card, it does well to just read the card. The most basic kind of magic card is a literal basic land. This is one resource. This is one land. That's what we call them. And it enters untapped and it taps for a green. You can play one land per turn. So at the beginning of the game, you decide who goes first by rolling dice or however you choose. You roll dice, someone wins, someone loses. Let's say you won. You're going to go first. First turn of the game, you're going to play a land. The land gives you one mana. You're going to look at your hand and you're going to see if you have any one drops. A one drop is just a card that costs one resource. You can't cast a card that's 3 if you only have one mana. Think about it like this. You're trying to pay for something and you just don't have enough money. You can't pay for something that's $8 if you have $1. You have to wait until you have $8. So let's think about it like that. Every turn, you can play a land and tap it for mana. And then the next turn, when you begin your turn, all of your tapped permanents become untapped. A permanent is just a fancy word for a card that enters the battlefield and does not leave. So basic lands, just produce a mana of the color that they correspond with. Mountains are red, forests are green, islands are blue. I can show you because Arena is awesome. Islands are blue, plains are white, swamps are black. These are the 5 colors of Magic. And when you start playing Magic, you can choose any of these colors and any combination of these colors, which is the beautiful thing about, I feel like, the game, is you're able to say, oh, well, I like green and black. Well, that's Golgari. Oh, I like blue and red. Well, that's Izzet. I like green and white. Well, that's Selesnya. Well, I like black and white. Well, that's Orzhov. And I like Azorius. Azorius is white and blue. Blue and green is Simic. Red and green was the Dinos. That's Gruul. Black and blue, that's Dimir. Then we have red and black, which is my personal favorite, Rakdos. And then we have white and red, and that's Boros. And those are the 2 color combinations of Magic. And then there's a bunch of 3 color combinations. There's a bunch of 4 color combinations. But when you're starting, you just kind of pick a color and you try to figure out what cards correspond with how you like to play the game and how you enjoy to play the game, right? I like to go really fast and kind of just like I use the term "kill my opponent dead" because you're trying to just play fast, efficient threats that deal damage and win you the game over time. So it's a resource-based game where you slowly acquire more and more value with your lands, and then as you play higher and higher mana costed spells, you get more and more powerful effects. Now, how do you win if you're both just deploying things, right? Well, you have these permanents called creatures, which are they're spells that you cast and they enter the battlefield. And think about them as the fighters of this game. They're going to be the entities that interact and kill so creatures kill creatures and they can also kill players, right? So you summon turn 1, play a swamp, taps for a black. Do I have anything that's taps for 1 black? That's 1 black. This is a 1/1 creature. So I'm going to play this 1/1 creature. And it's got a lot of text, so let's read it. Tiny Bones the Pickpocket is 1 black mana for a 1/1 with Death Touch. It's a legendary creature. Legendary means that this card, if you have 2 of them on the battlefield, one of them gets sacrificed. So you can only have one in existence on the field at the same time. It makes sense. Legendary creature skeleton rogue. Death touch. Whenever Tiny Bones, the pickpocket, deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target non-land permanent card from that player's graveyard, and mana of any type can be cast to cast that spell. So basically, when it attacks and it deals damage to your opponent, when you attack with a creature, you deal damage equal to the first number, and the second number is how much damage it takes to kill that creature. So think about it like this. Your stat line in Magic, if you're thinking about yourself as an entity, you have how much damage you deal and how much damage it takes to kill you. The first number is your power, and the second number is your toughness. That's what it means. And so when you attack, you go to combat, you say, I would like to go to combat, which just means I want to start attacking. And if your opponent doesn't do anything, then you get to pick how many creatures you want to attack with. And then your opponent gets a chance to pick how many creatures they want to block with. And then you do math. So let's say I attack with a 1/1 and you block with a 3/2. The 3/2 is going to take 1 damage from the 1/1, and then the 3/2 is going to deal 3 damage to the 1/1. So the 1/1's going to die. And that's how combat works. Now, in this specific scenario, Death Touch means that any amount of damage that it deals can kill the creature. So they would both die. But that's a very like specific instance. A lot of times in combat, it's just you subtract the power from the toughness, the, and then you do the same back. And so the game is very sequential. It's all about trying to make your decisions in the right order, and it's a lot of fun. If you enjoy card games in general, if you enjoy chess, I highly recommend Magic. The amount of possibilities that you have, the ways that you can brew are very, very unique. So if we just start with something kind of basic, So this is just it looks like a lot, but let's break it down, right? It's another legendary creature, so that you can only have one on the battlefield at the same time, but it's 4 mana for a 2/3 with flying. Flying just means that it can't be blocked by other creatures that don't have flying because it flies. And then there's other cards that have abilities that allow them to block creatures with flying, but we're not talking about that right now. Whenever you cast a second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this card, because that's his name, and draw a card. So a lot of cards have these kinds of synergistic abilities where you're able to set things up and you have cards that work with other cards. And a lot of sets, like this card is from a set called Outlaws of Thunder Junction, have interwoven themes and synergies where the cards all kind of work together. And so as you play cards one after another, the layering effect just makes the deck stronger and stronger. So a deck like this would be all based around casting 2 spells in the same turn. So you want a lot of very efficient, very cheap spells, and you want spells that reduce the cost of your spells. A spell in Magic is any card that is not a land. You play lands, and you cast spells. It's a very small differentiation. Now, besides creatures and lands, there are other card types, but they are less important than understanding the basics of combat and how to cast spells. So those two things are the majority of what I'm going to talk about today. I will go through very quickly the other card types, but again, these are not very important because they're more advanced things to think about. In the beginning, I would focus on trying to understand combat and just making sure you figure out how to build a deck that can be aggressive. Or if you want, you can try to play a bunch of removal, which is when you play spells that are not creatures that kill creatures. For example, oh, Shock. Very simple. This is one of the most basic spells. 1 red mana, so it's 1 resource, for 2 damage. It's an instant, which means that you can cast it during your opponent's turn and at any time. A lot of cards, like creatures, can only be cast during your turn, and when you cast it, you give your opponent an opportunity to respond because everything in Magic is paced. There's breaks after you do everything that you want to do or you change phases. If you take an action, your opponent gets an option to have a reaction. And you may not ever see it if you're playing like a normal game, but there's a lot of silent um, back and forth that's going on in the rules of the game. You're asking your opponent constantly, "Do you have anything?" And then they are constantly asking you, "Do you have anything?" And it's just a bunch of no's, honestly. And so instants can be cast in between these spaces. So your opponent asks, "I'm playing this creature. Do you want to respond?" You say, "Well, actually, yes, I have an instant. Boom, do a thing real quick." If you only have sorceries, you don't get to do that. That leads us to what a sorcery is. A sorcery is generally a more powerful card, but it doesn't have the flexibility of an instant. So, not being able to be cast at any time makes the card a lot worse. However, usually they scale it up with big flair and story um, tie ins. For example, Magic is a game about flavor and the story of like a certain place and time. So, a lot of the sets that come out are based around a world, and that world has like a unique set of mechanics, and all of the color pairs do different things on that world. And so flavor is how the art and the flavor text, which is a little line of text in the bottom of cards, ties in the effect and the name to the overall story of that world. So for example, this card is called Hell to Pay. It's X and a red for a sorcery. Hell to Pay deals X damage to target creature. Create a number of tapped creature or take blah, blah, blah. Create a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to the amount of excess damage dealt to that creature this way. So you can imagine this lady is burning her foes with fire, and any excess fire that just shoots off of her thing, off of her enemies, that doesn't burn them, just turns into golden coins and falls to the ground. Now, the flavor text is this little italicized paragraph to the right next to the treasure token. And this is on the bottom of the card, right above the artist's name. In this little break in the paragraph, there's a little space in the white box where this flavor text is usually found. And it ties the name and the effect into the set and the world overall. For years afterward, lucky explorers who found the cave could chip gold fragments off those rocky walls. So you can imagine burning your foes to a cinder, covering every inch of the surfaces with gold. Like, it's an amazing imagery. And so that's the beauty of like cards in Magic, is they have these effects and their cards and their game pieces, but they also tie into this overall story of like this world of like immense beauty and power. And then each color is like a faction that's fighting and struggling to survive. So we talked about Krem. Let's read his flavor text. Concerned for his apprentice's welfare, Ludwig sent his greatest creation to make sure Geralf got into the right kind of trouble. And you can imagine somebody who reanimates people is concerned about his friend who's a fellow sorcerer, and so he sends a zombie after to make sure that his friend is okay. And so it's like little bits of comedy, little bits of world building, little bits of drama, and the story is beautiful. So we have sorceries, instance creatures, and let's find an enchantment. You know what? It's probably not going to be one in this deck. Let's go back. Probably going to be one here. So this is an example of a deck that's just mainly creatures. It's just a billion creatures and some... I'm so sorry. It's just a billion creatures, and all the creatures buff each other, make each other more powerful. Oh, here we go. Enchantment. So let's get a basic enchantment. Okay. So Meticulous Excavation is 1 mana for an enchantment. So it just sits there. So an enchantment is a permanent. It sits on the battlefield after cast. Permanents have to say they do something when they enter, or they have to have some ability on them. Permanents usually just stay on the battlefield unless you take an action to do something with them. So for an example, this card is 1 mana for an enchantment, and it sits there. It's not a creature, it's not a spell, or it's not an instant or sorcery. An important thing, about instants and sorceries is when you cast them, they just go to the graveyard. One-time use. You know that one spell is shock is 1 mana for 2 damage. You do that, and it goes to the graveyard, and your card is gone. So they're good in certain situations where you need to just do something, but they're less good if you're trying to get a board presence. So an enchantment, much like a creature, also artifacts as well, stay on the battlefield. Just stays until you do something. So 3 mana to return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. If it has Unearth, you exile it instead, and then return that card to its owner's hand. Activate only during your turn. So you get to pay 3 mana, return something you control to its owner's hand. If it has Unearth, you exile it, and then return that card to its owner's hand. So you can save something over and over and over again for 3 mana. And the idea is, flavor-wise, right? This person is waiting to pull these creatures and these things that are going to be destroyed up out of the battle. And in combat, right, you can attack, and if your opponent blocks with something bigger, you just pay 3 mana and pick it up. And so it gives you this ability to have these effects. Now it has flavor text. Let's read the flavor text. Remember, students, if it's glowing, humming, or whirring, don't touch it. And that's just this teacher reminding the students not to get hurt. And then you can imagine the student still has to yank the teacher still has to yank the student up and out of the danger zone. Now, that's an enchantment. The final card type that we're going to talk about is artifacts. So an artifact is a very powerful. Let's find a colorless one. Oh, it's a bad example. So Karn Legacy Reforged is a 5-mana star. Stars refer to something in the text that will tell you how much it is. It's a legendary creature artifact golem. Karn Legacy Reforged's power and toughness are equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control. So its power and toughness are equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control. He is an artifact. And so as long as nothing's greater than 5, he will at least be a 5. At the beginning, a 5/5. At the beginning of your upkeep, add a colorless for each artifact you control. This mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells until on a turn you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. So, beginning of the upkeep is a part in the turn after you do all the untapping I said. So, in the beginning of a game, you untap all your turn, you untap all your lands. You go through a beginning phase, which is called the upkeep. Then you draw your card for turn, and then you can take your turn, go to combat, declare attacks. Then there's another portion of the turn where you can just take a normal turn. And then you go to your end step, which is when your opponent can do things before it's their turn. So in that beginning section, you make a colorless mana, which is just a mana that is not white, blue, red, black, or green. So it's a colorless mana that can only be used to cast a generic amount. We haven't talked about this yet. So if you see in the casting cost, which is next to the name, a number and not a symbol, that means that you can use any type of mana or colorless mana to cast that card with. A lot of cards have a restriction on what kinds of mana you need to cast it. Gruff Triplets is 6 mana, but it's 3 green. You need 3 green. And so you need at least 3 green producing resources in order to cast the spell. If you have all planes in play and you draw Gruff Triplets, you're out of luck because you can't play it. You have to have not only the right amount of money number-wise to cast it, you not only have to have just 6 resources, but you also have to have the right amount of mana in the right combinations to cast all your spells. So it produces colorless mana, which doesn't help with any of the the symbol costs. However, the numbers can be used. The colorless mana can be used towards casting the numbers, which is we call generic mana. This is all a lot, and I'm so sorry. So what I kind of want to do is just jump into a very basic discard changes. Very basic game real quick, just to wrap this all up so that you can see what we're doing. So we're going to go into standard. We're just going to play a standard game with goblins. And I'm going to talk through the cards as I play them and explain, what we do. Each color has a different identity of like what the theme that it does is. And so what Goblins is trying to do is deploy a bunch of small threats and kill your opponent as fast as possible. Creatures deal damage to your opponent equal to their power, and we both start with 20 life. So the mentality of red and other colors too, but mainly red, is if I can deal you as much damage as I can as fast as possible, I'll win the game because you'll just die. Other colors have different philosophies about how they play the game and how they like to sequence their turns. But for right now, I just want to show you how combat works and the basic magic philosophy of, So this is a good hand. I have a combination of lands and spells. And we want to be able to play a spell every turn on curve, which just means a 1/1, 1 mana spell on turn 1, a 2 mana spell on turn 2, and a 3 mana spell on turn 3. So turn 1, I'm going to play a Reckless Lackey. This is a 1 mana 1/2 with First Strike and Haste, which is good already. First Strike means that it deals its damage first before my opponent's creature deals damage, unless it also has First Strike. Haste means that it can attack, meaning that it can, attack my opponent as soon as it comes into the battlefield. It also has an ability where I pay 3, sack it to draw a card and make a treasure. So if my opponent tries to kill it, I can just sack it. Now, my opponent has a 1/2, so I can safely attack with this. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to attack. And we're going to deal damage. Oh, they didn't block. Usually, we just bounce here. But my opponent felt like I had some kind of trick, so they did not block. I'm going to play a Sear Slicer Goblin. Sear Slicer Goblin makes a Goblin at the end step if I attacked this turn. So it just makes more guys as long as I'm being aggressive. And this is really good in my deck because I'm trying to go as wide as possible. So I'm not going to block because this deals 1 damage and my guys all have 1 toughness. So if I deal damage to it, I might not be able to kill it. If it deals damage to me, it'll definitely kill me. So a lot of Magic is being able to make these combat-based decisions and trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to do this? How is this going to work? Opponent played a pump spell, which just means that it increases the creature's power until end of turn. And so this creature became a 4/2 until end of turn. And then they cast that shock I was talking about earlier to kill my 1 mana, my Reckless Lackey, which is really smart because I have a Lord, which is just a term for a card that gives other creatures of a certain creature type +1/+1. So my entire deck is Goblins. And so all of my Goblins get +1/+1, and I can pay a red to kind of just kick one in the air, and then it flies for a little bit. But as soon as it lands, it dies. So I play the Dropkick Bomber. The Lord buffs both my 1/1 and my Goblin. So they're both my Sear Slicer is a 3/2, and my 1/1 was a 2/2. So I dealt 5 to my opponent on turn 3, which is very good. And so now we're in a position versus my opponent where we're just trying to race. They play another pump spell, gives a creature +2/+0, and they get to create a monster roll. They play Lightning Strike, which is another spell that deals direct damage to anything. It can kill creatures, it can kill my face. So they're what I would call burn. They're trying to deal damage to me directly to kill me as fast as possible. But I'm able to kill them faster because Squee is a 3-mana 3/3. When it attacks, I make a 1/1 tapped and attacking. And because I have a Lord, it's a lot of damage. Well played, opponent. So I would say that's the basics of how to play Magic. You just play a bunch of creatures and you attack your opponent. There's a lot of nuances to each of the colors, and it's not always that easy. But I think that, as a good place to start, I would just start there. You don't need to be, a master at anything. You don't need to try to break your brain. Just pick something that you're interested in, that you enjoy, and just try to have fun with it because I think it's the best game in the world. And if you want to try something fun, try out Goblins, and if not, no worries. The world needs more blue mages because the world needs all Magic players. Everybody's welcome. So I hope you guys have a beautiful day. And this has been a Goblin's Guide to Magic the Gathering.